Welcome to Startup Dads, a podcast about the highs and lows of building a business and raising a family at the same time. For more information about the topics we cover on the podcast and other Startup Dads related content, you can follow us on Twitter at StartupDadsPod. I'm Amrit, co-founder of Hyperexponential, a tech startup that I co-founded in 2017. It's grown from a two-person team working out of my kitchen to a profitable business with several large clients and more than 20 team members across London and Europe. I'm also dad to Evie, my first child, who was born last December.
And I'm Joe. I'm dad to Esme, Lila and Nancy, who are 10, 8 and 5. I've been working on startups, in startups or with startups virtually my whole career, which is about 20 years now.
In episode 1, we talked about the beginning of our startup journeys and the difference between reality and expectation. However, this is the Startup Dads podcast, so today we're going to talk about the dads bit, the decision to start a family while running your own business. So Joe, as we talked about previously, you've been a startup guy since you can remember, since the beginning of your career. Starting a family while just being yourself. Did you feel like when you had kids, did it change your attitude to working for a startup? Did you have a perception of risk that changed before and after having kids?
Yeah, I guess for me, I've always liked having my own business or being involved in very early stage businesses. And I think I've kind of always known that I wanted to have kids as well. So it was sort of more like ticking off life goals than a calculated decision, like, right, now's the moment. And I remember I must have been kind of in my mid-20s and my mum telling me, if you wait until you're ready to have kids, you'll never, ever have kids. And I think that sort of stays with me now. The financial security aspect of it is a little bit scary. At the same time, you know, you talk to lots and lots of women that leave corporate employment to go and have kids and are very unsure about how that message is going to go down, how it's going to be perceived, are very unsure about returning to work and how that can be. And so I've kind of always seen, well, actually, in a startup, there's almost none of those concerns because, you know, a lot of the time, the only person you've got to convince is yourself around that. So I've actually always kind of felt very fortunate rather than being too worried about it. I'm not a poker player with startups. You know, I've never put sums of money in that I either can't afford to lose or that feel disproportionate to the risk and the opportunity there. It's a funny one because I think when I look at things now and looking back, you know, I would say, oh, actually, that was a pretty precarious position to be in as a family. So I think I've probably been a little bit more grown up about it. I've always observed, you know, whenever you look at people that circulate financial advice, or, you know, personal financial planning advice, that kind of thing, and they always talk about building a monthly budget and then subtracting from your monthly budget what your outgoings are, and what you've got left at the end of the month is, you know, well, that's either your disposable income or some savings or whatever. Having only ever worked in startups, I've just never done that. I've always viewed income as a burn down, basically.
Yeah, you run your own cash burn.
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's like, right, well, I've got this much money right now and I'm going to be in real trouble if I haven't raised some other money in, you know, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 24 weeks, whatever that period needs to be. You know, and even now, you know, we're kind of pretty financially secure and comfortable. I still kind of look at it that way, that actually it's a case of feeling that even when you've got some revenue, that's not the key figure to look at. The key figure is, you know, kind of how far from the wall are you today and what's that going to look like in 4 weeks' time?
That's very true.
So, yeah, I think probably having kids has maybe matured the attitude a little bit, but I don't really think it was a big calculated gamble. You know, can we afford to do this? Is it reckless to have kids in this position?
I think it's one of those interesting things that if you are a startup-y sort of person, irrespective of whether you've had a business before or not, you tend to think a little bit like this. Before I had a startup, before I ran my own business, just like you, I've been very, very focused on, despite working for a very mathematical forecasting traditional profession for many years, I've always been really about, you know, are my prospects looking good, right? Is the weather good in the future? Am I going to be okay? Maybe that just means I'm a terrible planner, a terrible actuary. But like you say, I think, if you're the sort of person that's really, really worried about security and the prospect of not being extremely secure or not being able to manage that budget with tremendous certainty, it's almost probably a little bit of an informative statement about kind of whether running your own business is the right thing for you. So maybe it's a kind of reverse question, actually.
No, I think that's exactly right. Trying to do anything in a startup, if you're not a natural optimist, must be absolutely impossible. Must be so painful to do because, even if you do all your research and all the numbers are looking great, you need a fundamental optimism that this is going to work out well. If you can't lay your hands on that, then no amount of background analysis is going to convince you to give away security and continuity and peace of mind for something that it's a punt at the end of the day.
You hear the phrase that 99%, I think it's an arbitrary number, 99% of people who start startups, their startups fail. At the same time, I think lots of people start startups. Most people know that number going in. And like you say, I think you have to be an optimist. You've got to believe, even if the odds are against you, you've got to believe that you're the one that's going to make it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I can't remember who it was now, said something really interesting about this. They said, actually the number one cause of startups failing is not running out of money. It's the founders giving up. And those are not necessarily the same thing. The founders can keep going long after the money's run out. I think you do just need a little bit of true grit to see it through. Yeah, I also don't really have much of a plan B. If this doesn't work, I'll go and do that instead. It's like, well, if you're optimistic about plan A, then you never really spend too much time thinking about what plan B might look like. I think the stereotype would be that startups are a difficult place to have kids, and it's difficult for a startup to be a family-friendly place to work. I'm sure you've made changes to what you're doing now, but how did you feel about trying to make HX a family-friendly place before you had kids? And is it even possible for a startup to be truly family-friendly in that sense?
Sarah and I had been thinking about having kids for a while, and deciding to set up HX was certainly a variable into the timing of us having EV. I certainly think that if you have a startup, the one thing I would say is if you run your own business or you set up your own business, a startup or any sort of entrepreneurial venture, it is going to take up a disproportionate amount of your life. It takes up a lot of your life, and it takes up way more of your physical and mental space than a conventional job does. One thing I would say, though, is it doesn't take up your entire life. Setting up HX, one thing I've really learned, and I know it's a cliche, is I learned that there are 168 hours in the week, right? And you need lots of them for sleeping and eating and keeping yourself remotely presentable and human. But there are a lot of hours left after that. And I think you have to be able to prioritize and plan. So, in terms of your question about did I think about making HX while having kids? Well, absolutely. I knew it was going to be difficult, but certainly not impossible. The second part of that is, is it possible for a startup to be a family-friendly place? I think there are different aspects to that. One of the biggest things that sticks out to me about working at a small but rapidly growing business is flexibility. And, HX as a business, and I think most startups, they're very, very results-focused. Right? We are not fundamentally, as organizations grow and become more mature, I think they necessarily become a little bit more bureaucratic and systematic. At HX, we have to be incredibly focused on results. And as a result, kind of conventional mechanisms, the mechanism by which we achieve those results, it doesn't really matter. And in fact, we don't have the time or the people or the administrative support to kind of mess around with overly worrying about those sorts of processes. So a good example of that is, we don't really track hours at HX. Don't get me wrong, we work very hard. We have certain meetings that we need to be together, and we need to respect punctuality. But we don't track hours. And as a result, it's actually very flexible for me. If I want to get up and spend the first couple of hours in the day with Evie, help getting her ready, and then work a little bit later in the evening, that's not difficult. And there's no restrictions on me. And that's not just because I'm one of the founders. That applies to anyone at HX. Flexibility is incomparable, actually, compared to the larger organizations. I think the world is changing. I think the world is changing, and organizations are waking up to the fact that actually measuring results, it doesn't matter what size you are, is much, much more important than measuring inputs. And as a result, you're seeing flexible working, you're seeing much more support for people to look after their kids in a much more optimal way rather than a structured, traditional way.
The way you talk about it, do you think it's easier working in a corporate? As in, do you think the actual workload is smaller?
It's hard for me to answer that question being one of the founders. I certainly think my experience of having worked in corporates for 15 years is I think there's a lot more room for slack. I've worked for, growing businesses, but businesses that were, billion-dollar balance sheets. You don't get something done on a day. You move the needle by a couple of thousand, even hundreds of thousands of pounds for a large business. It doesn't really materially impact the business. Whereas at HX, pretty much everything everyone does. There are more than 20 of us now, but still everything everyone does has a leveraged impact on our success. So, I'm not sure whether I'd say the workload is higher, but more importantly, every single bit of the work counts for a lot more.
Yeah, it's like a closer connection between what you're trying to get done and whether it actually makes the difference you need.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say, though, there is you've got a very strong sense of how important what you're doing is, and that makes it much easier to get the work done. In the context of having kids, you have to prioritise. And I think, your question about is it possible to have a family-friendly startup, I think absolutely. I mean, I think since having set up HX, I have a much, much stronger sense of my priorities than I ever did. And that was before having Evie. Evie is my number one priority by a significant margin now, but she's not my only priority. And maybe that makes me a bad person, but she's not the only thing in my life. And I love my business and I love my team and I love my daughter more than any of those things. But you learn to be very economic and efficient with your time. A startup environment actually means that you can absolutely have kids. Don't get me wrong, I'm not going out and getting pissed 3 times a week. There are lots of things that I don't have time for anymore, but I have loads and loads of time for my business and loads of time for my little girl.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. You sort of touched on it a little bit then. Has your working pattern then changed a lot since you became a dad? Because obviously that's a little bit more recent than founding a business.
Definitely. One of the things that you don't factor in, I think, before you have kids is how important routine is for them. And I'm the nature of my brain and the way I work is I'm not a routine-based person. I can work very, very intensely for one thing for a very long time and then work very randomly on lots of small things. And therefore my schedule and the way I worked would be very flexible in the past. Whereas having a really strong routine is very important for children. The fact that Evie gets up at 7:30 means I get up very early. I get up before that and I do a little bit of work before that because when she gets up, I want to be there. And again, we're in the post-COVID world, so I'm at home much more and so I can afford to be. And I also stop work before Eve goes to sleep so I can spend time with her. That's the biggest thing. My working patterns have become a lot more structured. For some people, that will be a natural thing for them. For me, that's not natural, but it's not a difficult shift, I would say.
So have you got a rigid schedule for Evie? Do you have something pinned to the fridge with nap times? And
yeah, I mean, we have a rigid schedule for Evie. I don't think she gives a damn about our schedule.
Yeah.
She's definitely my daughter, and every time I try to get her to do anything, she instantaneously disagreed with it.
Yeah, obviously.
So we have a schedule, and we're valiantly trying to stick to it. It works, I'd say. I'm a good actuary, so I'd say 8 times out of 10, it's probably a good place to be.
And so, do you find your working schedule is actually implied by the negative space in Evie's schedule a lot of the time there?
Yeah. I mean, when Evie was first born, when I returned to work after Evie was first born, this was a challenge for me, but you learn to adapt. I'd say it's negative space. When you are one of the founders, you are the guaranteed gap filler for any of the problems or fires that get set in the business. And so, my work schedule is fit around the needs that I have to my team, or to whom I'm accountable, and to every single one of them, and to my family. And therefore, my work schedule is fundamentally in the subtractive space between those two things. Historically, it was a little bit more, I had more space because Evie wasn't around. Yeah, my schedule is very much moulded around that.
Yeah.
The question kind of applies a little bit in reverse for you, because you started having your own business, had kids, now your kids are a little bit older, and you're working with startups more than anything else. Did work-life balance have a different meaning for you before and after having kids? Obviously, work-life balance, the actual volume of work and life you have shifts, but in terms of the meaning for it, have you found a change?
Yeah, I mean, there was quite a long time through my 20s when it kind of didn't cross my mind that work-life balance was a thing. If I was awake, I was working, and I got pretty burnt out, and an awful lot of that time was not spent very effectively, but I was pretty much on it, the whole time. And I think part of that was naivety, and part of that was just not having had any exposure to an environment where that wasn't the case. But then when my first daughter, when Esme was born, I did have quite a lot of time off, and then went back on a pretty part-time basis. And the business I was working in then was a kind of flexible stage. We'd just offloaded quite a lot of the business and we're sort of figuring out what to do with the bits we hadn't sold. So for a lot of the time that Esme was tiny, I was quite a dominant feature in her life, I would say.
That's awesome.
That was really, really good. But then, equally, these things don't always last. By the time we had my third daughter, I was right in the middle of getting a new project off the ground. And actually, I think, she's called Nancy. I think when Nancy she was less than 3 weeks old, and I packed a bag and went to the States for a couple of weeks. And that didn't feel like a dereliction of duty at the time, because I think the family was sort of in a rhythm anyway. Obviously, Laura was on maternity leave in any case. She was not daunted by the prospect of having, an extra child to keep in the flock.
So can I ask, actually, that's an interesting point you've touched on there. There's a lot of talk about the marginal increase in difficulty of having kids. That's probably very leveraged when you're working on your own initiatives. You feel the impact, every inch of extra stress you feel a little bit more. Did you find when you had your second, did that take you closer to the tipping point? Were there things you had to do differently in terms of the negative space, you say, the subtractive space that kids take away?
Yeah, so we had our first two kids quite close together. They're only about 18 months apart.
Okay.
And I actually can't recall any of the early days. I think they were incredibly difficult. We were also refurbishing a derelict house at the time, and we just had such a lot on. And I kind of have memories of going into a room at 6:30 every morning and getting two babies out of two cots and lying them down on the floor next to each other and changing their nappies and getting them up. But I think it was a really brutal time.
How did you cope?
That was difficult. Well,
I'm seeking tips.
Yeah, I'm going to say badly. We just had a lot on. I was quite busy with work by that point. As I said, we're kind of in the middle of a house project as well. Having two kids very close in age like that, but not quite close enough that there's any sort of economy of scale in what you need to do with them, that was pretty heavy going. There's a lot of talk about baby schedules and sticking to a routine. And there are some very strong proponents with some very well-sold books about how important that is. What they kind of don't mention is that as soon as you've got one child already, all of that becomes immaterial, because your schedule is not dictated by the needs of the baby. The schedule is dictated by the needs of the toddler, or whatever age that next child is. And so the coping strategy was really just being absolutely led by what the kids would allow us to do, to the point that if they're having tea at 5 o'clock and they want a bath and then they're tucked up in bed at 7:30 or 8 o'clock, that is absolutely the time to get some sleep. If there's a chance that you're going to get 4 hours of unbroken sleep before someone wakes up and wants something, the idea of sitting on the sofa watching telly for a few hours because it's the evening is just absurd. And I think that was probably the biggest thing we really kind of got to grips with. Just take the opportunities to get what you need when the kids allow it, rather than trying to kind of hang on to this semblance of adult life that ultimately will trip you up.
That ties in really nicely to the point about leveraging flexibility if you're trying to do this while a startup. What you've described there at HX, if that was what any team member needed to do to get through their day and to keep doing what they wanted to do on the work side, this would not be at all a barrier or problem. And I think, that point about having flexibility, how you can make it work, because it's not just going to work automatically from what you've described there. And I agree, it doesn't, right? That's not something, any preconceptions you had of your life before, you can't you should make no assumptions about the extent to which those will continue. But if you can leverage flexibility to make it work, then I think that's something that goes a really long way.
That's absolutely true. People talk about this epidemic of sleep problems. Some people really suffer with that. I've never been a great sleeper. And actually, when I had kids, I did start to realize more and more that it's quite a superpower, actually. Being used to being tired and understanding that being tired is not the end of the world. You can still function. You can actually still do incredible things, even though you feel pretty rotten. And you just really hope that at one point in the future, you're going to be able to get your head on a pillow and get some proper sleep. That becomes quite a powerful thing to understand, because it can be really scary being completely exhausted and at your wit's end. And actually having a bit of perspective on it and say, yeah, okay, it's only tired. Actually, if this is the worst I'm going to feel for the next 5 hours because these are things I've got to get done before I can actually just collapse somewhere, that's kind of okay. You can leverage all of this to get quite a lot done.
Yeah, definitely. I think your point about being able to operate when you're a little bit tired or very tired, it fits as a broader point, which I think ties really nicely into the startup analogy, which is, you actually have to get pretty used to, as both a dad, as a parent, and a startup founder or someone working at a startup, doing your best when things are not optimal. Right? I think we work in a world now where everyone talks about optimizing your routine to get loads of sleep and eating really, really cleanly. These things are extremely important and you should strive for them, but it's also really important to be okay with doing your best when they're not. And you learn those things very, very, you learn to get by under suboptimal constraints.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. As my kids have got a little bit older, I've started to realize more and more, lots of people complain about work. And I think as a child in a working family, it's quite normal for you to see work as the enemy because it's the thing that is taking your parents away from you. And then when they come home, they're either complaining about having to do it or complaining that they spent doing too much of it or they didn't enjoy what they had to do. And I make quite a concerted effort to be very work positive because actually I want my kids to, in the fullness of time, figure out what they would like to do and create the opportunities that they're going to need to go and do those things. But I also don't particularly see work as a chore. I mean, sometimes it is, but actually maybe the side effect of, having spent 20 years only really working for businesses that I've got a big attachment to is that, work it's interesting, it's fulfilling, you meet great people, you learn nice things. And so I've really tried to be very work positive around the kids. And, I'll complain if I'm really tired. And on occasions where I've had to do kind of back-to-back work trips to places and have missed a weekend with them and that sort of thing, I will certainly not sound too delighted about that. But equally, I think if you teach your kids that work is a necessary evil, they will grow up thinking that work is a necessary evil. I think that's a pretty sad place to lead your kids, especially as a startup founder, when you really are the architect of your own destiny in this. I think it's a very healthy attitude to pass on to your kids that actually, first and foremost, work should be, probably fun, really. It should be something that you're choosing to do and that you get something from, whether it's fulfilling and stimulating and intellectually stretching, even, remunerative. I think all of those things are kind of up for grabs within what you choose, but it should definitely be something that you're proud to spend your time doing.
Yeah, it's really funny you say that. One of my motivations for starting this podcast was actually when Evie was born. Like any good tech entrepreneur, I went on YouTube, I went on Google, and I started looking for some podcasts about fatherhood. And a lot of the podcasts that I listened to talked in an incredibly begrudging way about work. And I remember one phrase that said, it's not fun, it's called work. That's why it's called work, not fun. And I thought to myself, what a sorry state of affairs. What a sorry way to have to live your life. Like you said, there are always things you have to do that you don't like, right? And there's always times where even running your own business, like you say, being the architect of your own destiny, you wonder how on earth you got here. But I feel, when you are a founder, you're actually really lucky to do something that you've created. And absolutely, it should be fun. And that's a wonderful thing. You're absolutely right. Evie's not quite old enough. She's just about, last week she learned how to crawl, which has opened up a whole new voyage of literal pain and suffering for her. But, I'm looking forward to, at some point, talking to her, teaching her about what we've done and how we made HX.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a bit of a cliche that work and family and what they call a work-life balance, that those are competing interests. I mean, it sounds like you've kind of found another way to think about that, or another way to put those together.
Yeah, definitely. I found there was a great quote, which is that work and life are not two different things. They're just very, very important parts of a whole existence. I think this is a relatively common thing amongst people with an entrepreneurial founding mindset, is that they don't see work as a kind of something that crowds out life. I think the one thing I would say, possibly a slightly offshoot to the question you asked about working patterns, is that you do need to be better with boundaries. I think it as you talked about, like you said, when you were running your business in your 20s, it's very easy for you to never ever switch off. Yeah. And that's something I still struggle with right now. Evie's been around for 8 months, as of today, in fact. and I still find it difficult to switch off. And I think that's going to be a lifelong work in progress. But there's no better motivator than to want to do it than your child wanting to play, or more accurately, crawling off towards that new plug socket that she wants to put her fingers in.
Yeah. Sometimes flexible working means the flexibility to work every hour that you can find in the day to do it. I think having some quite chunky other interests in life, like spending time with your family, I think it does help you to put some barriers around that time. There are lots of occasions where I'm with my family now where I think I'm absolutely buggered if I'm going to let work interfere with my enjoyment of this time. And so it becomes absolutely legitimate to leave your phone at home, or suddenly, turn it off somewhere. But I don't think that's the same thing as saying, oh, work's so dreadful, it follows me around everywhere, and
No.
I relish the chance to escape from it. It's really just about balancing it.
For sure.
I mean, something I find is that if I'm really hacked off with my family, which happens more and more as they approach kind of early teenagerhood, actually going and spending some time doing work things, talking to work people, or just concentrating on a work problem, it just puts your head in a completely different place. It's very difficult to be outraged at the behaviour of a teenager if you're concentrating on a nice way to solve a little challenge, or the best way to respond to something that someone's raised. And conversely, there are times where work is really challenging and it has a habit of filling the available space. And
Yes.
it's a lovely counterbalance to just say, well, all right, because I'm sick of one thing doesn't mean I'm sick of all of these things. I'm just going to go and do something completely different for a while. And I think that works really, really well for me, certainly.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I've got a very left field question, I suppose, that's come to mind, especially because Evie's still very young and so is HX. Did you have any pleasant surprises about being a startup dad that you didn't expect? So, you had 2-3 kids while building multiple businesses. Were there any times you're like, oh, you know what, actually, geez, I'm really lucky actually that I'm running my own business. This is something that would be, I wouldn't be able to do this, that, or the other in the corporate world.
Yeah, there's quite a few things in there, really. I think there have been quite a few occasions where I have thought to myself, I'm really fortunate that this is how my cards have landed. For instance, one thing I found is that in the startup world, you're always having to learn stuff. In fact, we talked about this a little bit last episode as well. You're always having to learn things. There's always 100 things that need doing that you don't really know how to do, and you're kind of improvising and to the best of your ability. And requiring that plasticity in your mind, and that, to use a cliche, that kind of growth mindset that, of course I can do it because I need to do it. Therefore, all I've got to do is figure out how to do it. I think that's been really helpful to me, especially kind of seeing my kids start to grapple with learning maths, for instance, or learning musical instruments, and seeing them be daunted by it. And I don't know, I have an awful lot of empathy with the child that just can't get that chord right on the guitar. And I think, well, that's interesting because, I was feeling exactly like that about something, and it's rarely more than 48 hours from the last time I was faced with a situation that just needed a little bit of, let's say, a bit more than lateral thinking to get through it. So I'd say it's kind of symbiotic, though. I feel like my kids have coached my growth mindset, but I feel like I'm pretty fluent at coaching theirs as well.
That's
I think that's probably the biggest angle to it.
I can relate to that a lot. I think having worked in the corporate world, where actually generally you start your career, if nowadays, or as it has been certainly for the last 15 or 20 years, on a graduate scheme, and slowly your comfort zone is expanded, and you generally work, the envelope that you push is not that big. And, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that people working in the corporate world all have it very easy, not by any means. But generally, you follow a career progression where actually you're outside your comfort zone in relatively incremental steps. Whereas as a child and in a startup, there are days where I'm completely out of my comfort zone, not days, weeks, months, actually, where, Michael, my co-founder, and I, we used to joke, at the very early stages of HX, we'd walk across London Bridge to see clients and investors kind of on a weekly basis. And kind of every month I would joke with him. I was like, so Michael, what completely new set of skills do I have to learn this month, right? We learn how to incorporate a business, set it up. Then after that, learn how to pay people, learn how to build a product, learn how to sell it, all of these different bits. And actually, I am probably much more sympathetic now, when I look at the challenges that my team face, or that I can see how in the future when Evie, the step of going to school for the first time or going out to play with people you don't know, actually probably feels that's probably a pretty profound event for a child. Again, it's probably the sort of thing, if you've got the right mindset, you make that a bilateral learning experience, don't you?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. All right. Time now for Startup Shoutouts, where Amrit and I shine a light on some of the early stage businesses that we really admire and talk about what it is we like about them.
Startup Shoutouts.
My startup shoutout is Feedback Fish. Feedback Fish, it's a fascinating company. They have created a widget that you can embed within a website to collect issues, ideas, and compliments. And it allows you to collect that feedback and receive it as an email. So it's the sort of thing I suppose you'd embed in a website or a product. And our product at HX, our product, which is called Renew, is a website SaaS-based product. I find this startup really interesting. It's was a business that was built in a hackathon over, I think it was 72 hours, by the creators of a web design framework called Styled Components, which is a bit geeky, but it's a tool, a system that we've used in our product. It's a really cool, incredibly well-designed, well-thought-out product for something that was created in a really short time by some people who I really respect and admire as technologists. And I was just shocked at how incredibly simple and effective and well put together it was for a product that was created in an incredible burst of creativity over a time-boxed window. So the website is feedback.fish. So I've learned that there is a .fish top-level domain. So yeah, go check it out.
Oh, will do. Sounds good. I'd think about this. I really like a little company called Data Smoothie. So the founder, Gear, described it to me as the medium of data. And I was kind of, well, what does that mean? He's like, well, like medium like the blog. And so they built a tool that makes it really easy to tell stories with data. In the same way that you can draw charts or put data sets into a statistical package to discover what's interesting about them, this kind of does that for you. And it just creates a kind of interactive visualizations from data. It's specifically targeted at analysts and researchers and marketers a bit, that kind of thing. But it's a really snazzy little tool. And I think I love it because I'm fascinated by data. There are so many amazing stories wrapped up inside data sets, some of which we know about. The huge majority, no one ever pays enough attention to even understand what's going on with them. And so I think I just, A, I really respect the effort, but B, they're making it possible for more of these stories to be told and for more people to get more understanding of what some of these things actually mean. They've got a few really good clients already, quite a few kind of market research organizations and polling organizations use them. But yeah, I'm really enthusiastic to see where they go next because I just love what they do or what they make possible.
That's really cool. As you know, HX is our product is very much focused on making better decisions and deriving insights from data. So I'm going to look them up and maybe look them up as a business to see if HX can work with them. So that's useful directly for me. If no one else, if none of my listeners find it useful, I will have found that useful. So thanks. Awesome. That's all we've got time for. Thanks for listening to Startup Dads.
See ya.